Welcome back. Are any of the parties or panelists or tech panel having any problems with their headsets with the translation? Okay, we will now proceed to the questions from each of the parties. We will go in order. Each party will have a 5-minute round. You may pass if you want. Just so you have some situational awareness about your time, you will see lights up on the table where the witnesses are, red, yellow, and green. Green, at 5 minutes, it'll turn yellow when you have 1 minute left, and red when your time is up, just to help you if you're not able to keep track of the time. We'll now begin with questions from Asiana Airlines.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have 3 questions for Captain Cashman or Mr. Myers. First, initially, I'd like to refer to exhibit 49 at page 6, please. Okay. 14I, India. In our report dated May 2011, EASA, European Safety Agency, noted that in a certain automation modes, the auto-throttle wake-up function of a Boeing 787 was not operative and therefore does not protect the aircraft. EASA noted that consistency in automation behavior has been in the past a strong contributor to aviation accident and concluded that Boeing would enhance the safety of the aircraft by avoiding exceptions in the auto-throttle wake-up mode. Why didn't Boeing revise its automation design to address this recommendation?
This EASA recommendation came up during the 787 certification in a similar manner to the FAA response item that we discussed earlier. This came out as a recommendation, which means that Boeing is not required to respond, and it is not a certification issue. I should reiterate that both the FAA and EASA evaluated the design of the filch hold mode and the auto throttle activation features. They found the features to be safe. They found that they met certification requirements, and both agencies certified the operation of the airplane. When we demonstrated these features and when we discussed with the FAA and EASA our reasons for the design, they agreed with them, and the response was that we should add some information into our manuals. In the 787, it's added to the airplane flight manual. In the case of the 777, there was already equivalent language in the flight ops manual, so we didn't need to make any changes there.
Next question. I'd like to report to exhibit 2B at page 117, please.
Could you repeat the page number, please?
Exhibit 2B, Bravo, at page 117. 117, please. Thank you. FAA lead test pilot Captain Eugene Arnold stated that he was caught by surprise a feature of the autopilot design philosophy, namely that in certain autopilot modes, the autothrottle will not wake up even during large deviations from target speed and does not support stall protection. He identified this as a safety issue, given that Captain Arnold was highly experienced FAA test pilot. Does the fact that Boeing's automation logic surprised him indicate a problem with the automation design?
I think the issue really was that there was a misunderstanding on when the autothrottle would wake up and when it was controlling speed. And Captain Arnold did not select a new altitude or hit altitude hold, so it did not revert to speed mode on the autothrottle. He was not following the commands, but he was operating the system and he was monitoring the speed when he leveled off, which is how he caught the condition. In the end, when he understood that this design goes back to the 75767 and 210 million flight hours, I think he felt it was not as critical an issue, but we did take his advice and put the words in the manual.
Thank you. Final question. When the FAA mandated improvements in the 787 manual on flight level change, did Boeing consider implementing changes in the manuals of other planes with the same system? And what about in the FCOMs of the 787 or the other airplanes?
The words that were added to the airplane flight manual for the 787, the equivalent words are already in the 777 Flight Crew Operating Manual, the FCOM, and they have been for at least 15 years. That's as far back as our history could go. So we didn't need to add additional words to the manual. It's already there.
Thank you.
Asiana Pilots Union.
Yes, Madam Chairman. Captain Cashman, you talked about auto throttle wake up. Isn't really an issue auto throttle envelope protection?
The envelope protection of the auto engage or wake up function is an element of the stall protection, but it is not the stall protection system. In other words, it's related to operation when the auto throttle is turned off or it has been disengaged inadvertently or a failure dropped it off, that it will engage itself. It's not a function that if the auto throttle is already in another mode, it will change the mode and do something to control speed. So it was really there to come alive and engage itself when it had been selected off.
Captain Cashman, I'm looking at FCOM 4-2-9. Why auto thrust won't support stall protection in flight level change?
I'm sorry?
FCOM 4-2-9.
Is it 20.9?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, okay. I have page 420.9. And I'm not clear on the question, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Why auto thrust won't support stall protection in flight level change?
That's right. And what we demonstrated in our training scenario to expose crews to the feature, and that again, it's demonstrated by turning the auto throttle off when it is engaged, and it will come alive. And that's really what it says, and that's what it does. It's in the flight crew training manual as well. Now, perhaps I'm misunderstanding the question.
Captain Min, would you like to rephrase the question?
Okay. And next question, then I'll ask again. Okay. Mr. Meyer, has there always been a note in the Boeing AFCOM regarding no auto throttle wake up in flight level change mode?
In the 777, there has always been the note. It was originally in Chapter 9, which is the stall protection chapter, but it was relatively recently moved to Chapter 4 when we did an audit of our manuals and tried to make them more consistent across the models. And also we wanted to make sure that all the auto throttle information was in the auto throttle chapter. So we moved it from Chapter 9 to Chapter 4. But it has always been in the manual.
And Captain Cashman, how reliable is the auto throttle to maintain the select speed?
Well, I'm not sure in terms of how to express reliability. It's a reliable system, but it is a fairly simple system, and it can disengage, which is why we have crew members with their hands on the throttle in critical states, critical operations. But I couldn't give you a probability number as to what the reliability terms are. I don't have that information. We might be able to get it, but to be honest, I don't know of a chronic service problem with auto throttle disconnects.
Yeah, Captain Cashman, I'll say again the question, why no auto thrust speed protection in flight level change mode?
The auto throttle protection feature or wake-up feature is only when the auto throttle is turned off. In a flight level change mode, the speed is being controlled by pitching the airplane, not by moving the throttle.
Okay. If there's no more question, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Air cruisers.
Madam Chairman, we have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Boeing.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Captain Cashman, can you please describe the FAA demonstration of flight level change mode during 777 certification?
Yes, there was a specific test done with an FAA certification pilot and engineer on the 777 to demonstrate in flight level change hold mode that there is no wake up or auto engagement feature. And that was demonstrated. It did not wake up, and that was the correct response, and it was certified that way on the original 777.
Great, thank you. Boeing has no further questions.
Thank you. City and County of San Francisco.
Madam Chairman, we have no questions.
FAA.
Madam Chairman, FAA has no questions.
Okay. We'll move to the board members. Member Sumwalt.
Mr. Myers, good morning. You stated that, I believe you stated earlier in response to a question from Mr. Park when he asked about the levels of alerting there, the warning and the caution. And as I recall, you indicated that the caution, when you put the caution in there for the low-speed alerting, you did it for the cruise phase of flight. Did I understand you correctly?
That was the original impetus for designing the alert. It was designed, though, ultimately to be used throughout the entire flight regime.
Okay. Because I was looking at 14 CFR 1322, and it doesn't just say that the levels of alerting would apply just to the cruise segment. So you're saying that was there consideration to adding for example, I flew an Airbus A320, and it had an oral alert that said speed, speed, speed. Was there any consideration to giving a more salient alert than just simply a master caution and an ECAS warning, ECAS alerting?
Yes, we certainly looked at that as we designed the alert. Remember that our low speed protection is actually an entire hierarchy of indications that we provide to the crew. We provide guidance and control information if the crews choose to select it on. We provide performance indication in terms of current airspeed and vertical speed, etc. And we also then provide a whole host of supporting cues like the amber band and the barber pole and the pitch limit indicator. And then we also provide tactile feel back to the crew so that they can tactily tell from both the position of the column and from the trim situation that they're getting into a slow speed condition. And we also have out the window cues, even if their heads are out, that they can, like such as deck angle, that their airspeed is getting slow. So the airspeed low alert is just one element of that entire progression of cues, and the ultimate cue of stall is the stall warning. We do have a stall warning. It's the stick shaker. It's both audible and they feel it in their hands on both sides. So we do have the full progression of stall warning and low speed protection, and this airspeed alert is just one element.
Thank you. I'd like to call Exhibit 14 Delta, please, page 1. And Mr. Myers, the fifth bullet point down, it says that the flight deck philosophy is to design systems to be error tolerant. What is meant by error tolerant?
When we design systems to be error tolerant, we consider two basic things. First, we try to design the system such that we minimize systematic error, and the system itself doesn't lead to errors on the part of the crew. But then we also design the system to mitigate random human error, because errors will always occur. So that is why we build in this whole progression of protections that start off relatively subtle and then get more and more salient until the ultimate warning.
So, given that the situation where when in flight level change and the auto throttle is in hold, do you consider that to be an error tolerant design?
I think I should reiterate briefly what Captain Cashman was talking about. We looked at this design, and we were faced with a design choice. If we did a wake up or some sort of mode transition of the auto throttle and hold mode for a low speed condition, say, we would have had to transition the mode without the pilots authorizing that change. It would have been an uncommanded mode change. And then we would have had most likely two systems controlling speed, both the auto throttle and the autopilot, which would mean we would also have a mode change in the autopilot system so that we could rectify that situation. So in that case, we would end up with two mode changes and a thrust increase. And if the slow speed condition came about, say, because of an engine problem, we might also be pushing thrust up into an asymmetric thrust condition. So we would have potentially two mode changes uncommanded by the pilot. We would have a thrust increase, possibly an asymmetric thrust increase, and we'd be violating our philosophy about the pilot being the final authority. So we looked at the two situations. We thought the less confusing of the two was, in fact, the design we chose.
Thank you very much.
Member Weiner.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Cashman. When the flight deck development as big as 777 comes along, who do you go to get information and review? Who in the industry do you have take a look at the flight deck, the design?
Well, when the program launched, we hired quite a few additional human factors people than we had previously had. But we went out, we brought in teams for several audits and design conditions, Airline Pilots Association, International Federation of Airline Pilots, human factors people from NASA, FAA, a number of universities, both foreign and domestic. It was a large group of people. We also brought in, with our customer airlines, some line pilots that actually sat in our design meetings and gave us input on various features and problems.
And what role do the kickoff customers have in terms of reviewing the design?
Well, some of our early customers, we had both engineering and pilot teams at the company sitting through most of our design reviews. There were only 3 or so airlines at once that I recall that were in that role, but they provided a lot of input. We brought in teams from their airlines to review both the training syllabus as well as different technical functions as we moved the airplane along.
And who were the kickoff customers for the 777?
United was the kickoff customer on the original 777.
And who else followed then closely behind that? Who would have been involved in the reviews?
British Airways was involved, ANA. There were 8 of them, and I'm trying to remember. JAL, ANA, Cathay Pacific.
It wasn't simply U.S. Western Airlines. It was worldwide.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, you sell airplanes around the world, operated by people from all kinds of different cultures. How do you handle the cultural differences that are inherent in different parts of the world?
Sure.
We try to engage, as Captain Cashman said, airline pilots and folks from all over the world. When we design the systems, we try to accommodate English as a second language. We try to accommodate cultural differences as we make the design. We're a bit fortunate in that English is the language of aviation, but we do understand that English is a second language for many. So, for example, on the 777, we went through and audited every single one of our alert messages, and we reorganized them to make them as short and as clear as possible. We made sure that we didn't abbreviate words differently on the text message, say, than we did in the checklist, so that that pilots could make character matching. And so we did a number of things like that through the design process to make it as simple as we could.
Are there any variations in the flight deck depending on which part of the world an airplane gets delivered to?
There are a few. We have, say, units, Fahrenheit versus centigrade for temperature and kilograms versus pounds for weight. But in general, no. We have a very consistent design across all of the airplanes because they tend to move around.
So the design philosophy doesn't change depending on which part of the world?
No, it doesn't. There's more regional variation probably to navigation requirements and what equipment goes on the airplane than the architecture. At one time, we built airplanes and actually made cockpits that had switches go one way for part of the world and another way for the other, and some in foreign languages. But that's pretty much standardized now.
Thank you.
Member Roskine.
This is for either Captain Cashman or Mr. Myers. There's the design philosophy, then there's execution. Can you please talk about any formal process you have to identify the discrepancies between how the design was intended and how it actually ended up being executed? What formal processes do you have to identify those discrepancies and then address any changes that need to be made?
So, be happy to. When we go through the development process, we have a formal aircraft development process, and at numerous stages in the development of the airplane, we go through design reviews. And in those design reviews, we bring in a wide variety of people, including the FAA and other regulators, pilots from all over the world, and a lot of different people within the company. In addition to those design reviews, we always have an engineering simulator or two, and we go through a long series of structured tests to evaluate just that. We look for areas of negative transfer, areas of confusion, areas where there may be systematic error, and we make corrections as we can. Once the airplane's in service, we have a very formal safety process where any incident that comes up is reviewed as a potential safety item. It's tracked all the way to completion if it's determined that it is.
And let me get you focused a little bit more. So I'm trying to get, when you talk about air tolerant, it's human-centered, where's the process that actually makes sure that what ends up in the cockpit lines up with that philosophy? So I appreciate the venues you just talked about. Now I'm wondering, what's the formal process within those venues that somebody's actually saying, well, the way this alert went on, doesn't reflect our intended philosophy of, the pilot's awareness of this. I mean, where is that formal evaluation take place?
So we have a series of requirements that we develop. The top level requirements are these philosophies that we've been showing you and others. And then we have a couple tiers of requirements below that. And they're all annotated as parent, child, and as we go through the reviews, we look at these requirements, and we look at the next lower level requirements. For instance, the quiet dark concept that we use in the design of the airplane is actually a lower level requirement than the top level philosophies you saw on the displayed today. And then below that, we start getting into specific design requirements for the airplane. And then below that are the very specific design requirements that we provide to our suppliers of our avionics equipment or the flight controls equipment, et cetera. And all of those requirements are tied to the higher levels and make sure we've got good parent-child relationships with all of those requirements. So that enables that kind of discussion that you're talking about.
And then the process change? So somebody identifies during that review that, here's what we intended from a design standpoint, but here's what it's doing in the cockpit. What's the change process to make sure it gets addressed?
So the change process is that if someone identifies a specific requirement issue, then we will formally evaluate the requirement and make a change. And if the change is made to a specific lower level requirement, then we need to necessarily review the parent relationships and see if that means that there's a change there and we need to alter that, or we need to expand it because the world has changed or whatever. And so that would lead then to change in the upper level requirements. But we've also had it where the opposite has occurred. Someone has an issue, and we review the higher level requirements and say, no, those higher level requirements are valid. We need to do something else for the lower level requirement and go back and review it again.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you. Captain Cashman, if I heard you correctly, I think I heard you refer to using the mode control panel for various aspects of manual flight. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Could you give me an example of how might use the mode control panel for manual flight, what would it do for me?
Well, most basic would be if you're hand flying the airplane and you want a heading marker, you would have put the heading on the mode control panel, or the altitude alerting system would be set with the mode control panel altitude select. So if you deviated from an altitude, it would alert you.
Could I command a vertical speed and fly it manually, and then the flight director bars would alert me to that?
Yeah, if you had the flight director engaged, yes.
And now, let me ask you about the flight level change mode. Does the speed remain constant during flight level change?
If you're following the guidance, yes.
And how does the system determine what rate of climb or descent to use? Is that based on the distance that you're climbing or descending?
That's correct. If it's a short distance, it will attempt to reach that new altitude in 2 minutes. It adjusts the power to give an approximate rate at that level. So you're not, for instance, if you're climbing 1,000 feet, you don't put in full thrust. You just put in a small amount of power to climb. It's much more economical. If you're climbing 10,000 feet, then it would go full thrust.
Okay, thank you. Now, a couple of questions about the auto throttle. If I understand correctly, if I disengage the autopilot by doing something manually overriding the autopilot, then I get a chime. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is there any kind of analogous chime if I do something to override the auto throttle?
If you disconnect the auto throttle, then you will get an alert on the ICAS display and a chime.
Okay, if I manually override the auto throttle, then what will I get? What indication will I get?
No, you won't, because if you're overriding, you're physically giving it a command.
I see. Okay.
It's considered a normal thing to do, so we don't alert that.
Thank you. Okay, a couple of questions for Mr. Myers. Could I get the Boeing slide that talks about airspeed low, caution level alert? Yes, that one. So Mr. Myers, you mentioned that some of these features, it wasn't clear to me which, came as a result of a low-speed event in a 7.4 that caused you to expand the response to that into some of the other airplanes in the fleet. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, you did. This particular alert came about as a 747 incident.
So which aspects of this alert are you talking about? I'm looking at several aspects. I'm looking at the caution warning light. I'm looking at the oral symbol, the yellow box around the airspeed, and then the airspeed low indication in the center screen. Which of those aspects was already there and which resulted from the 7.4 event?
The crew alerting system was there from the very beginning. It was developed on the 5767. It's on all of our wide-body airplanes. So the whole concept of the master caution light, the master caution lights in front of the pilots, the master caution oral, all of that system was in place. So all we did in this particular event was add an additional caution message to the existing system. So before there were 70-some cautions. Now there's 70-some plus one after this.
So the yellow box around the airspeed was already present?
No, that was added also. That corollary information along with that alert was added as well.
Okay, so how widespread in the Boeing fleet is that? Are those several areas of airspeed low caution?
The airspeed low caution is on all of our ICAS airplanes.
With all of these aspects, the master caution light, the oral, the airspeed low, and the box around the airspeed?
Yes.
Do you have any sense, if you know, of how common that is in large transport airplanes, those features for airspeed low?
I'm not familiar with the specific designs for all of the other airplanes.
If you know, do you have any sense of the airspeed low warning in an Airbus? If that's a fair question to ask.
I know they have an alert, but I don't know the details of how it actually works.
Okay, thank you.
Just to wrap up that, since we still have that slide up, if we could pull that slide back up, I wasn't quite clear on what existed before versus what changed after the 7.4 event. When did the 7.4 event take place?
The 7.4 event took place right about the time the 777 went into service. I forget the exact date. I think it was sometime in 95, which is the year the 777 went into service. And then it was, I think, 96 or so where we actually implemented the new alert on the 777.
And specifically, what's new?
The only thing that's new of the whole hierarchy of low-speed alerting, from display indications through the stall warning, is the single caution message that comes up, and the box, the amber box around the current speed that correlates with it. That's the new part. The caution system and all the other stall warning cues were part of the original 777 design.
Okay. I'd like to ask a basic question of Mr. Boyd. What's the purpose of automation?
Are you asking from a regulatory perspective?
I'm asking for a one-sentence answer of the basic of what's the purpose of automation.
Well, Madam Chairman, it's very difficult to answer because there is such a wide range of what automation means. It's not a clearly defined term. It could be anything from something very complex like an autoflight system to the pressurization system controlling the outflow valve rather than a manual control, all the way to some other very minor mode or minor function. It's such a broad term, it's hard to say what the purpose is, and I guess I would have to say it depends on what you're automating.
Okay, so what's the purpose of auto throttles? Is it to reduce workload? Is it to increase safety? I mean, I'm just looking for a really big picture understanding of why you would implement that rather than manually fly all the time, be responsible for throttles all the time.
Well, that's I would say that's fundamentally a question for the designers to answer. It's not a regulatory mandate.
So when you look at the certification of a system like that, what are you looking for?
Well, the two major questions that we look for in any certification issue is, does it comply with the regulations and is it safe?
Can something comply with the regulations but not be safe?
Absolutely, absolutely. Regulations do not cover everything. So we can find that a given design, while not, there may be some aspect of it that is not covered by the regulations that we deem to be unsafe, and then under the aircraft certification rules at Part 21, we can require a change to the airplane to address an unsafe condition.
Okay. For Boeing, as you all are designing aircraft, would you say that the aircraft that are being delivered now versus the aircraft that have been delivered in the past are being equipped with more automation or less?
Compared to at least the last 25, 30 years, they're very similar. There have been increases across the fleet, particularly in the navigation and the modes that affect economy that our customers want, the world wants to be able to improve the efficiency of aircraft. But for the most part, the auto flight modes to do that are very similar back to the early 80 models of airplanes.
Okay. You made a statement earlier that the auto throttle system is a reliable system. You said, but it's simple. What did you mean that it's simple?
It's not an auto land system, for instance. An autopilot for landing, there's generally 3 of them voting and deciding. An auto throttle is more or less a single thread system that if anything in that system hiccups, it can drop off.
Okay. What's the purpose of stick shaker for the Boeing designers? When would you expect it to alert? Is it going to alert in time for the aircraft, for the pilots to escape from the situation? When does stick shaker alert?
It alerts to the potential of the airplane stalling.
So that doesn't necessarily account for the time that they might need to get out of it.
Well, I can't remember the exact regulations, but we do look at a variety of entry rates. It depends on how many knots per second you're losing speed and how fast the pilot reacts. But in most cases, it is enough to present a full stall.
And the low speed alert, is that provided in enough time to actually be able to obtain the needed speed?
To prevent a stall?
Yes.
Yes.
Even accounting for spool up time for engines?
You know, we looked at a variety of conditions, but that again is still dependent on, there are corner conditions where you can eventually end up where it will not. But that whole characteristic of what the airplane is doing prior to the stall and the other cues, we designed to prevent you from getting there. But the alert itself will, in almost all cases, be enough to prevent a full stall. Not if you're going straight up, for instance, but it is in normal flight of a jet transport.
Are there any additional questions from the board members? Member Sumwalt.
Thank you. Mr. Myers, I told you that I flew the Airbus and it had an oral warning that's alerting that said speed, speed, speed. In response to the 737 accident, Turkish Airlines accident in Amsterdam, did Boeing make a modification to the 737 similar to what I'm describing that's on the Airbus?
Yes, we did. After the Turkish accident, we did add a speed oral to the 737. The 737 does not have the ICAS system that the other Boeing airplanes have, so the alerting system is different, and the philosophy around the alerts is different. So in the case of the 737, to do an equivalent alert, we had to use a different design. Because we don't have unique orals for cautions and warnings on that airplane, we need to get immediate awareness from the crew in a different manner. And because we don't have centralized messages, we need to highlight the area that the crew needs to attend to in a different manner. So that led to a different design for the 737 than for our ICAS airplanes.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Cash.
If I could add to that one question you asked about the stick shaker. To put some of this in perspective, when we are in a wind shear event with very high wind gradients and very turbulent conditions, we are having the pilots fly the airplane at the stick shaker. And they're very high movements, pitching up, pitching down, and it's adequate to do that in very severe conditions. That kind of bounds whether the alert is timely enough to prevent a stall.
But the conditions may be different with respect to the throttle position and the engines, their availability at that in that specific maneuver you're talking about. Correct? They're not at idle.
No, that's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And a jet engine at idle for a prolonged parade will take around 8 seconds to get full thrust.
Thank you. Member. Yes. Member Weiner.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on the line of discussion related to stall recovery. You said that the stick shaker gives adequate time for the crew to recover the aircraft in the case of a stall. But in this particular case, does the stall recovery require some loss of altitude, or can it be done without loss of altitude?
I'm not sure what's behind the question.
What's behind the question is we've got an airplane with basically low speed, low power coming up on stick shaker, and the airplane can be recovered from stalls in that condition, but in that recovery process, is it necessary to trade some altitude for speed?
I think the answer, in this incident case, though, the airplane did not stall. But to answer your question, if you got into a stall or close to it at that altitude, do you have to lose altitude? And the answer is yes.
Okay, so the old axiom of powering out of a stall is no longer valid.
In some cases, in a jet transport, it could be hurting you if you are fully stalled.
Thank you.
Yep.
Member Roskine.
Either Boeing person. There's a lot of focus on alerts here. We've talked about some specific ones, but I'm like you to identify the formal decision-making or criteria that exists for you to decide what belongs as a warning, a caution, how you decide to make it audible versus tactile versus visual, how you make sure that it's information for the pilot who's flying as well as monitoring. Sort of what is there? We've had some examples of that, but I'm curious in your process, is there a formal decision-making process and criteria for how you decide where those go?
We do have a formal process. I referred to it briefly on the slide when we first started talking about the alerting. The warnings require immediate crew awareness and immediate crew action. So that's a real high-level description. And cautions, immediate crew awareness, and potential future action. So as we look at each alert and we look at the range of operational conditions where it may trigger, we have to decide how to place the alert. Some issues that go into that decision are whether there are other alerts associated with that particular condition. So, for instance, in this condition, the warning event is the stick shaker, and so the caution event comes before that with a good 7 seconds-ish of time between the caution and the warning. So again, we have this whole hierarchy of information we provide to the pilot, from the subtle to the drastic, and we try to make sure that there's a good progression there. We hate warnings to come up before caution.
So, given the time, can I ask that we get some of that information submitted for the record? So if you have a formal process with established criteria, if you could provide that for us to decide the level of warning, what the information channel is, whether that's audible, visual, tactile, etc., and how it's targeted for either the pilot flying, pilot monitoring, or both. So rather than take the time now, if you have that process, could you just submit that for the record?
Of course.
Great, thank you.
Vice Chairman.
Captain Cashman, I asked you a couple of questions about the mode control panel and manual flight. I would like to know, is there a way that I could set up the mode control panel to give me a virtual glide slope, not dive and drive, but a virtual glide slope and a localizer to manually fly by following the flight director needles, a virtual constant descent approach into this airport? Is there a mode that would allow me to do that with the glide slope information failed?
Yes, there is. In fact, the localizer approach in use for the incident had that available.
So how would I set up the modes to do that, to do what I just asked?
If you just wanted to monitor it, it's on the navigation display next to the PFD. It was on there, and it comes up when you select the approach. You could couple to it in a vertical navigation mode.
So what approach would I select, ILS or localizer approach?
The localizer approach would, with the glide slope out, it would give that vertical navigation profile.
Oh, so the vertical profile would be there without me selecting anything beyond just the localizer approach?
In this particular case, that approach had it in there, yes.
So I could follow that, and it would create essentially a virtual glide slope to be able to do a constant glide slope landing.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You could fly it with flight director, or just look at the indicator, or you could couple to it with the autopilot.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe it would help if you could pull up an exhibit that actually shows that. And while you're doing that, I would have one follow-up question for you all with respect to the criticality of a low-speed alert. In what phase of flight do you think that is most risky or is most dangerous with respect to a failure to monitor airspeed?
So I'll answer from the perspective of a flight deck designer. We understand that...
And you know what, if you either want to explain the chart that's up right now to show what was available to the crew, or we can pull the chart down and explain it later.
Actually, the chart before this might be, from a perspective of airspeed, might be a little, or I guess it's 2 before. Where is it?
14D 13, I think.
13? You want to use 13? Are you asking glide path or airspeed?
Virtual glide path.
Oh,
yes.
virtual, okay. So it is on that chart on the lower left corner. There's a white scale with a magenta diamond. That is generated by the flight management computer, and it indicates to the pilot where they are relative to the flight management computer computed glide path. On a localizer-only approach, the flight management computer develops a glide path that approximates the PAPI indication. And so in this particular picture, the magenta diamond, which represents the glide path, is a little bit above the pilot who is in the center of the scale. It's a pilot-centered display.
Vice Chairman, does that help? Okay, great. Thank you for putting up that slide. And now maybe we'll go back to the question with respect to low speed and the critical phases of flight.
Okay, just make sure I have the question. So the question relates to the could you ask it again? I'm sorry.
Sure. We've talked a lot about the low speed alert, and you talked about the genesis of the low speed alert being a 747 event in the mid-90s that occurred at cruise. And we're talking about this event and the design philosophy for that low speed alert, but here we're in an approach phase of flight. And so I'm trying to get a more generic understanding. Obviously, you will look at a lot of risks when you design your aircraft. You try to design against some of those areas that might be vulnerabilities for you. And so I'm asking about airspeed and the criticality of airspeed in different phases of flight. Are there certain phases of flight where airspeed is going to be a do or die situation?
Absolutely. So when we design the airplane, we assume that air crews are very good at monitoring when it's a critical phase of flight, when it's a relatively short duration, when it's an area of high interest. And we design the airplane to assume that the pilots will fly the airplane when they haven't actually asked the airplane to fly. So in the case of a final approach, we assume that is an area where the crew is actively monitoring the critical flight parameters, and there's no more critical flight parameters in glide path and airspeed. So we definitely expect that a crew flying final approach, whether it's an auto land or whether it's a manual flight, visual descent, whatever, visual approach, we would expect them to be actively monitoring airspeed, glide path, and the other critical flight parameters on the primary flight display.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. I think probably there's going to be some discussion about what flight crews are very good at monitoring at some point in the future, but I'll leave it at that. I'd like to go back to the parties to see if you all have any additional or follow-up questions, beginning with Asiana.
I have one more question, Madam Chairman. This question is for Mr. Mayers. Have you ever received any complaints or comments from other pilots or airlines or anyone else regarding the lack of a wake-up function identified by the FAA and European Safety Agency?
There were two incidents that were already discussed this morning during the 787 certification, the response item 12 and the EASA recommendation that was done in conjunction with that one. But other than that, no, we have not received any other in-service events in the 200 million flight hours that that system's been on our airplanes. And when we went through the customer working together portion of our validation for both the 777 and the 787 subsequent to that, and we brought in crews and said, so what don't you like about the airplanes that you have that we need to fix? That issue never came up. And then we always review in-service activity in the fleet and make sure that if there's incidents in the fleet that we respond to them through our formal safety process. We have had no incidents of the basic auto throttle modes like flight level change coming to any of those formal processes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Captain.
I have one question.
Asiana Pilot Union.
Yes, the Captain Cashman. Boeing says flight level change is not recommended.
Captain Min, is your microphone on?
Yes.
If you could just bring it closer.
Okay. I say again. Boeing says flight level change is not recommended during the final approach. It doesn't strictly prohibit it. Would there be a reason to be ever used it? If not, why did Boeing not prohibit its use?
There are cases, for instance, with a circling approach where the minimums are low enough that you would want to be able to do that. It's not very often encountered, but there are a few cases. In general, it would be the final approach fix, and that would be the as low as we would go with it.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Air cruisers?
Madam Chairman, we have no questions. Thank you.
Boeing?
Madam Chairman, we have no questions.
City and County of San Francisco?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. FAA?
FAA has no further questions,
Okay.
Madam Chairman.
We'll go back to the tech panel.
Mr. Park?
My question goes to Robert Mayer.
How many other oral caution with four beeping tones are there in the Boeing 777 system? How many other
Mr. Park, can you pull the microphone a little bit closer to you?
Yeah.
I think I heard the question. You were asking Mr. Park about how many caution alerts there are on the 777 that would generate the master caution quadruple chime beeper. There are, I don't know the exact number, but it's between 70 and 80, and it varies a little bit because some of them are optional features for the airlines.
Dr. Bramble. Captain Cashman, can you describe for us Boeing's guidance on pilot use of the auto throttle? Yeah, in terms of when it is expected that the pilot will use the auto throttle versus operate.
를 사용할 때 네, 기본적으로 저희가 오토 스로틀을 권장한 데 있어서는 수동을 할 수 있다라고 할 때 사용하는 것이고
proficiency reinforcement. But the reason we recommend it is there's a couple of reasons. One is that if you use the auto throttle in rough conditions, you can still set the speed at the same value of V reference plus 5 knots. If you're manually flying, you have to increase the airspeed and add on half the wind and the full gust value to the V reference speed. So by keeping it with the auto throttle on, you're flying the approach consistently with the same attitude and amount of power. You don't have to increase the speed of the airplane for wind gusts and so on.
I'd like to bring up Exhibit 2L, page 3. This is a more precise presentation of the PFD and the ND, similar to what we were looking at earlier. This came from a simulation that very closely approximated the actual flight. And you can see at about 1,400 feet. We are showing on the vertical deviation indicator about 432 feet high, and I wanted to make sure that everybody got a feel for what that VDI looks like. And I just want to readdress the question to Captain Cashman. Is there any reason why this information should not have been available to the accident crew?
I believe it was available. As long as they had flown VNAV somewhere on the route, then this would have come up in the selection of the localizer.
And would this information have taken the flight all the way down to the runway?
Yes. Well, the end point is about 50 feet above the threshold.
Okay. I have one other question, once again, for Captain Cashman. We talked about a number of the cues that are available to pilots to determine where they are relative to the glide path and to the speed that they're supposed to be at. One we have not talked about very much is the pitch attitude of the airplane. Does Boeing provide anywhere in its FCOM or other documents the characteristic pitch attitude that you would expect the airplane to be at when it's fully configured on an approach ready to land?
Yes, we do, and I believe it's the flight training manual. And we give some guidance for loss of all air data so they can fly attitude for speed.
So just once again, I realize I'm going from asking you to go from memory, but can you think of probably the characteristic pitch attitude of a 777 with flaps 30 on configured for landing?
2 to 2.5 degrees.
And if a pilot's flying the airplane and he observes that the airplane is not at that pitch attitude, what inference would you expect him to make?
If he's flying level or less, I would think that would cue him that he's flying slow.
So does Boeing expect pilots to understand the characteristic pitch attitude of the airplane when they're flying an approach?
We do, actually, and that's why we put it in the manual, because that information is necessary for the loss of all air data.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Maybe just a follow-up to the line of questioning that Captain Cox was asking about with respect to the feel. There is feedback, correct, on the yoke at the angle that they were at. How many pounds of pressure would you have expected to be applied to the yoke to achieve it?
At which point?
In the accident flight.
Well, when they were decelerating all the time, it would have been a gradually increasing force.
Culminating with a maximum
I think somewhere, I'm trying to remember what the flight recorder showed, but I think it was up towards 80 pounds.
80 pounds.
Yes. The airplane, from what the data shows, was not trimmed after the autopilot was disconnected. So it could have been down to the top of the amber band. The force could have been 0. But once they entered the amber band, the force on the stick goes up by a factor of 5 for every 10 knots of speed.
Okay. Tech panel, you want to finish out?
Yeah, let me just finish with Mr. Myers. Member Rosekind had asked that you would provide the formal process for the level of warnings. So I asked that we make that exhibit 2X and that it's due by January 18th, 2014. And that's all we have.
Thank you all very much. And again, we appreciate everyone's flexibility on this tight day. We're going to take a number of breaks. We will now adjourn for our lunch break. We will reconvene at 12:15 for technical panel 2. There are food options on the promenade level. Thank you to panel 1 for your answers and for your participation. We're adjourned until 12:15.